Yeah. And Claudia, I could share the presentation. We tried this just now before you joined, right?
Oh, okay. Excellent. Thank you so much.
So I will do that for both of us. You said you couldn't really do it. So.
Yeah. Because I don't have any rights on my computer and I couldn't change. For some reason that I can change it for other technologies, but it doesn't allow me to change it for Google. It was Google Chrome, so kind of interesting, right?
So, I'm sorry that we had to hold it on Google because it's the most accessible platform in Iran. Yeah, we can access it from phones, Android, iPhones. It's the most, compatible and accessible of all here. So we had to choose that. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I've used it for meetings as well, but I haven't shared presentations.
Not for presentations.
Yeah. So,
okay.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay.
value. Yeah. But for you, it's a free day today, right?
Yes, but still, yeah, because of the differences between the holidays, it's okay. Yeah, the participants are accustomed to it. Yeah, in your day, so it's fine. Yeah, great. So I will start the introduction, and then we can start. Okay. So. I would first like to welcome everyone that are here, and so let's start. Dr. Claudia Arado is a professor of international politics in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Her research, according to King's College's website, has developed a critical political analysis of security practices. As more and more problems and people become constituted as objects and subjects of security, her research has inquired into the effects of this has on political subjectivity and democracy. Our next guest who will co-host this lecture is Dr. Tobias Blank, a university professor of Artificial Intelligence and Humanities at the University of Amsterdam and the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation. He's also affiliated with King's College London as Professor of Social and Cultural Informatics. His academic background is in computer science and political philosophy. Together, they have written a book entitled Algorithmic Reason, The New Government of Self and Other, which analyzes the ways in which big data and algorithmic practices have reconfigured how social and political problems are made knowable and governable. This afternoon, the guests of Shiraz University's Digital Humanities Association, Dr. Erdogan Blank, will give a lecture on making data visualization, theoretical and methodological perspectives. So without further ado, I'm honored to invite our first esteemed speaker to the virtual podium. Thank you. Okay, so I will turn off my webcam so that, there wouldn't be any problem. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Merzad, for the introduction. It is a pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about some of the research that Tobias and I have conducted together. So I will start by discussing a paper, telling a bit about the paper where we have used data visualization, and we have used data visualization in an interdisciplinary way. As you have heard, I am my discipline is international relations, not digital humanities, but for some time I've been engaging in dialogues with digital humanities. So this paper is about this interdisciplinary conversation about data visualization. And I also like to acknowledge our co-author, Victor Halbosay. And then in the second part, the talk, Tobias will tell you a bit more and maybe in a bit more detail about his research in and with archival materials, right? In archives, about archives, and with archives. So the title that you can see here is the title of the talk, on the different subtitles of making data visualization. So here, particularly in this paper, we are interested in using data visualizations as a way to engage with the parliamentary archives in the UK. So I'm not sure whether anyone has been looking at parliamentary archives around the world. So the parliamentary archives in the UK have been digitized, and they kind of exist in more or less a structured form. So the paper that you can see here was published at the end of 2023 in a journal called Global Studies Quarterly. So the journal is open access. Tobias, can you move to the next slide? So you can see it here. You can, if you are interested in looking at visualization or anything else, you can access it. You can access it online. Next slide. So in my discipline, international relations, data visualizations are actually not used that much compared to, let's say, maybe digital humanities, I don't know. But like much of humanities research, more broadly, in my discipline, scholars have also been interested in analyzing the production, the circulation, and the reception of images. Right? So a lot of the analysis has focused on images that are already there in the public and the media, how they are produced. This could be still or moving images like videos and so on. There has also been a lot of interest, for example, in popular culture, and how popular culture kind of reproduces depicts and at the same time reproduces certain imaginaries of international politics, whether it's about relations between states, transformations of international order, or other global phenomena. So therefore, many scholars have argued that much of the research engaging with visuality, right, in international relations actually comes after image production. So it works with images that have been produced elsewhere and by others, so it offers a lot of this work of interpretation. Scholars have also tended to engage with qualitative methods, and they have seen data visualization as somehow a quantitative rather than a qualitative method. So, for example, they have engaged with aesthetic methods, with ethnographic methods, again, discourse analysis and so on, but they have approached this qualitative, right? So rather than, for example, other forms of content analysis or, again, here, data visualization. However, more recently, scholars have argued that we should challenge the distinction between qualitative and quantitative methods, because a lot of methods, including data visualizations, cannot be simply equated with one side of this method, right? So, therefore, scholars talk about, for example, mapping methods and what they call quali-quanti methods, right? So this combination rather than the boundary. And in this guide, we try to build on this research to actually engage with data visualization in a conversation with digital humanities. And what was interesting for us about research in digital humanities, the data visualization indeed, although it appears to be an image as well, in the end, it is not an artifact. Right? But it is a method of interpretation, a method of working with text. Moreover, data visualization can work with many forms of data, not just quantitative data by any means. It can work with text, images, numbers, sounds, you name it. And we are also interested in how data visualizations actually the making of data visualizations can bring new interpretations and therefore new ways of engaging with the world into being, right? It makes certain things visible, intelligible, legible, and so on. Can you move to the next slide? So in digital humanities, this idea of data visualization as a method, right, as a method of inquiry, of exploration, and of interpretation has been taken up by several scholars. However, this has also met with quite a lot of criticism, and you can see here a quote from Helen Kennedy and Rosemary Hill, who point out that data visualizations are not neutral windows onto data. Right, so they privilege certain viewpoints, perpetuate existing power relations, and create new ones, And as such, they argue they do ideological work. In response to some of these criticisms, however, digital humanities scholars have also proposed to develop other perspectives and other ways of engaging with data visualizations. So this have been, for instance, ethical workflows, data feminism, which is what has inspired us in this paper in particular, but also post-colonial and abolitionist data visualization. So this is based on a book that discusses the visualizations done by W.E.B. Du Bois that was shown at the Paris exhibition, I think, what was it, at the beginning of the 20th century. In any case, I'm trying to remember with the year exactly, but I do have the book here, but I can check that later. I took it out just on purpose. Anyway, that's something you can also find, I think, online quite easily. Oh yeah, the book was also on the image. Next slide, please. So in our work, we started to explore data visualization as part of our research in the parliamentary debates, and particularly trying to understand how parliamentary debates deal with questions of security, right? So what kind of contestations of security, what kind of criticism of security, critiques of security emerge, particularly in relation to the role that intelligence agencies were playing, and this was focused on the UK. So these trajectories, of course, are difficult to analyze just qualitatively, given that the parliamentary debates extend over decades, are dispersed across many areas. They can range from foreign policy to surveillance, and they extend over many texts. But what was interesting for us as well in the parliamentary debates is that we could approach these questions historically and try to understand the transformations that take place over time. So in engaging with data visualizations, we have drawn on two main approaches, but particularly the one on the right-hand side, so the feminist approach, or at least on my right-hand side as I'm looking at the screen, feminist approaches to data visualizations. So in terms of the literature on digital humanities, we can see two approaches that have emerged kind of in response to data visualizations that attempted to be concise, clear, just show the data, as some of the earlier approaches contended. So this was, on the one hand, a hermeneutical approach that situates data visualization in relation to meaning and meaning making that is situated, as you can see here, and the question of interpretation, and what Joanna Drucker calls interpretative knowing. And the feminist approach that focuses on the political dimensions of power and labor, and therefore adds this to the hermeneutical questions of situatedness, complexity, uncertainty, and partiality of knowledge. In their book Data Feminism, Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein kind of give us like 7 principles, right, to bear in mind when making data visualization. So they ask about power relations, they ask about questions of embodiment and emotions, they ask us to avoid drawing new boundaries. But we focus particularly on 2. This is a question of power, right? So what kind of power relations become visible, legible, and intelligible through our data visualizations, but also what making data visualization means in terms of who is doing the work. Can we move to the next one? So one important element in terms of thinking about data visualization as a method and thinking about making data visualizations is that we don't have just one artifact, right? One kind of data visualization, but we can think of data visualizations as a multiplicity, as manifold visualizations that help us explore an archive, explore a text, ask different questions. So therefore, for us, data visualizations were more specifically understood as methodological devices that orient our research towards the contestation, we're talking about the contestation and critique of security. But we also see data visualizations as an unfinished process, right? Along the lines of a project that you can see here, which is the anti-eviction mapping project. So the anti-eviction mapping project uses a whole array, and you can look at the link, a whole array of data visualizations from the more traditional, if you want, bar chart visualizations, to very different types of visualizations to map dynamics of ownership, rental and renting properties, but also dynamics of dispossession in the Bay Area in the United States. And there are a mixture of reports, a mixture of very different types of data visualizations, very different types of maps. And it is within this multiplicity of producing many data visualizations that we can come to see different things and see things differently, but also understand perhaps things differently. So I inspired here by how digital humanities have approached data visualizations through the metaphor of sandcastles. Right, which indeed, and I quote here from an article by Hinrichs, Forlini, and Moynihan, the metaphor of sandcastles emphasizes visualization as a process and highlights the value of its byproducts, transient, unstable, often unfinished, and quickly discarded artifacts, which are both manifestations and drivers of a visual thinking process through data. Right. So again, these are not finished projects, but they are all, in a sense, they can be discarded because they help us explore questions. So in the rest of the paper, we engage with data visualizations, not, taking the sandcastles metaphor, but actually unpacking the making metaphor. So how do we make data visualizations? And the first element that we mentioned, also inspired by a data feminist approach, is the question of working, right? So who does the work? Which in the case of data visualization, the first question is actually who also does the work of cleaning the data. And I have here first image, if we move to the next slide. This is basically how we started working in the parliamentary archives. We wanted to see what organizations are mentioned, so what organizations play a role in this debate about security. So we use entity name recognition. But then, of course, we had to start doing the work of cleaning the data. And this, as the parliamentary archives have records of oral discourse, organizations have very different names, right? The names can be truncated sometimes, they can be referred to differently, sometimes acronyms can be used, sometimes, references are kind of known at a particular moment in time, but names change and so on. So it took a lot of time and a lot of interpretations to actually decide which organization or which entity here in this case was what. And you can see that we had a whole column basically debating these interpretations and what was what. So the question of work and cleaning the data is therefore central, but we also need to think it about differently, as you will see in the next slide. Kind of making this kind of big kind of rotating move to suggest the next slide. So here again, Ignazio and Klein remind us that no data set or analysis or visualization is the work of one person alone, right? So all this work with data implies many people who are actually engaged in the work of interpretation. So the cleaning as a metaphor is in many ways the wrong metaphor, but it's also an interesting metaphor to work with at the same time. So feminist scholar Françoise Vergès has asked us, when we start asking questions about the world, she suggested that it's really important to ask who cleans the world, right? And we can take inspiration from her question to ask her who cleans the data, which is always, as we have seen, a work of interpretation, right? And for us, it meant that we worked over several years with colleagues, with students, right? We spent a lot of time cleaning the data, which kind of has its own challenges, but also Tobias and I also spent time cleaning the data and trying to kind of make a lot of decisions about interpretive work, and then coming back again and again to these decisions. Again, Joanna Drucker reminds us that even a very simple method of word counting actually requires a lot of interpretation, right? Deciding which words to select. And we had discussions about the exclusion, for instance, in many of the methods of stop words, right? And which of the small words could be important and which ones could not be important. The Parliamentary Archive had its own challenges and its own idiosyncrasies, because debates are grouped in particular ways. In the case of the UK parliamentary debates, they are grouped in volumes, but it doesn't mean that these volumes tell us where a particular field or area of interest starts and where it ends. So we had to make a lot of decisions about what was relevant to the security debates and the intelligence agency we are interested in, and where one of these debates ended and where it started. Right. So again, we made a whole lot of interpretive decisions, which we kind of had to negotiate among ourselves. Secondly, the second approach to making data visualizations is using visualization as a methodological orientation, right? So we are really interested in how security is contested in Parliament. So therefore, we wanted to understand both what is there, what is dominant, but also, elements that kind of could be less important or diminished in some way or another, or maybe silenced or absent. The first visualization, so we have a lot of visualization. We've gone through many different kind of steps, and Tobias can tell you more about this because he's worked a lot on kind of these very different kind of types of exploration of text, not all of them through data visualization, but a lot through data visualization. So the most simple one, we try to look at the most common words and kind of organize them in relation to topics, political questions, and organizations across this corpus that we had. And small things stand out, like, for example, the question of trade unions. I won't go into it, but it was interesting for us to think, okay, why are trade unions present there when, questions of security are very much about national defense, interstate relations, and so on. The second move that we made was to actually try to trace how these debates change over time. And to do that, we had to select 4 time periods in order to be able to see differences. Now, selecting the time periods or epochs, right, in kind of historical archival research, again, requires a lot of interpretation and some disagreement as well. So we have used here like global political events that are well known that we thought would have informed actually debates in the UK Parliament. So this was the end of the Cold War, but also the 2001 terrorist attacks in the United States, which kind of led to the global war on terror. And again, very important for us because we are looking at the intelligence agencies and also surveillance, was the 2013 revelations of surveillance by intelligence agencies in the US and the UK and elsewhere as well by Edward Snowden. Right, so we had 4 periods and then tried to see the most frequent words across these time periods, which also started to give us an understanding about how differences can emerge across these time periods. So, for example, the 1990s, which was for us the second time period that you can see here in green, we had much more interest, or we had a period in which the question of oversight, right? The question of accountability and oversight of the intelligence agency was very much at the core. While some of these words were not present in the first period. And then we tried some other visualizations of which we can show you only a little bit. We tried to actually see which words appear only in 3 of the time periods that we are looking at, but not in the 4th one. So you can see here, these are some of the keywords like agency. So again, agencies, interestingly, don't appear in the first time period, but they're common to the other 3 periods. And then again, I think important also doesn't appear in the first time period. So different words relations kind of led us to ask questions about why or how come some words are apparent at a certain moment of time and not at others. And then we had to go back often to the archive to think between these, right? And finally, this question, we already started here to use a relational model to see how these words actually relate to freedom and security. So if in the first 2 visualization, we just focused on the most frequent words and kind of asked, why is the word present here or not present here? Here we try I think someone is having a chat, but I have muted them. Sorry, Katine. So we try to understand what's in context using the word to that model to try to understand how words are related to security and freedom. So often when we think about security, and again, we would be looking at many different things, like the opposite of security is freedom. So we try to think which words are related to security and freedom. And here, Tobias can explain this much better than me, I'm sure. We try to understand the greatest numerical distance, right, between how words are related to freedom and security, and they are illustrated via the length of the dumbbell that you can see here in the graph. And the visualization also shows the orientation of the relation, right, as the direction of the dumbbell in each row. So green for freedom and red for security and vice versa. And the time periods, again, are encoded in the color of the dumbbell. And one thing, so we have, you can see here a lot of words that come up, like reports at governments, again, agency, country committees, right? So we can see these forms of oversight or bureaucracy, you can call it, in relation to security. But also like small things that, again, drew our attention is, for example, the relation between people and publics. Right. And again, it was interesting for us that they were differentially connected to security and freedom. So again, we thought what the people, what role people play in kind of in relation to the question of freedom, again, is very important in terms of how people are seen to be an active or a passive subject, whether they're spoken about or whether they're active and therefore they engage in actions themselves. So just to conclude and now turn to Tobias, what we tried to do with the data visualizations here was actually draw attention both to the small things, like what is perhaps not known, not observed, not there in the broad or the kind of dominant debates around security, around intelligence agencies, but also try to understand how making data visualization is a way of asking new questions, right? Of kind of being curious, being surprised, and asking new questions about archives, about textual material, potentially also visual material, and also seeing things differently. So again, these are unfinished. Many more visualizations could be made. And I think now that I turn to Tobias, he will show you actually even from the same archive, maybe some more visualizations. So Tobias, over to you.
Thank you, Claudia. Can you hear me? Because I cannot really see anybody while I present. So hopefully that's going to be okay. So I will now continue a little bit with this discussion. And I thought because your background is in humanities and linguistics, and we have talked here very much about visualizations, but of fairly simple representation of the information, that I move now to words mainly and their relationships. I move on to more kind of complex methodologies in this project, but also in related projects that Claudia and I have been doing. So how does the humanities meet international relations? And the first project will be simply about a wider question of international politics, and then we pick up on this idea of archives again in the second project. And I try to speed up a bit because unfortunately I have to leave at exactly the hour for another meeting. So I want to leave at least 15 minutes for discussion. So the first project that we worked on is now looking at another archive, which is very important in history, which is the UN Security Council since the Second World War. And it's a little bit my own kind of exploration of kind of different dimensions of deep learning. Now, if you try and publish in your future career, you will see that publishing can be quite difficult, and this paper took definitely far too long to be published. So some of these things that I'm talking about now are actually already kind of a little bit outdated and are done a bit differently nowadays. So the UN Security Council is, of course, maybe the single most important body of the UN United Nations, and the resolutions give us a nice record of international politics since the end of the Second World War, when the United Nations were set up. Now, if you try to do this analysis, you will find quickly that the unfortunately United Nations official archives are less suited for this kind of work because they stop you very much from downloading these documents. So I went to this website where people did that manually, and I could then scrape it from this website. Then the problem was that these resolutions are in PDF format, and the earlier ones are actually images. So we also had to OCR them, I think, about until the mid-1960s. And they also contained different languages. Nowadays, the kind of official languages of the United Nations are distinguished into different documents, but then the same document contained different languages, whatever, English and French. So you also had to filter out the different languages, which explains a little bit different performance that we will see in a minute for the earlier periods. After all this has been done, my real interest was in a way to find out whether we can do this kind of complicated analysis, more complicated analysis with this kind of more complex data that we have in the humanities. So one reason that Claudia Ebterhal and I decided to work more with word and word counts for the parliamentary archives were that this actually works quite well for data that is, in that case, oral history data or oral data because it's parliamentary records, and where more complex methods actually traditionally failed. And I simply wanted to find out whether with these kind of new world of neural networks and deep learning, we can now address these more complex data that is typical for kind of digital humanities. And in those days, I tried to explore with the kind of two early frameworks. One was fast AI, and then the early versions of what is now Hugging Face, which I'm sure many of you will know, and I think you can also access from Iran. And that has very much quickly become the kind of standard way of doing this in an open manner. And the Hugging Face way of working is that you go online to the website, and then it's basically a large collection of many different types of language models or foundation models. And you select the foundation model that you are interested in. In those days, it was still the kind of very standard way of doing it, which was the BERT model, which is one of the earlier models done by Google. Then you have to adjust your data so that it fits these models. So you have to tokenize it so it actually can talk to this model. And then you select a particular way of doing it. In our case, that's classification. But actually, I wanted to make my life a bit harder and also see really whether these models give us new powers. And rather than doing these abstract time periods that Claudia just described, which are always kind of wrong, historically speaking, because nothing in history stops at a certain year or a particular boundary. I want to see whether we can use these models to directly predict from the resolution, in this case, the actual year it's been written in. So whatever resolution 5 was written in the year 1951. That meant that I had to change the classification metrics to because this then becomes a regression task, so where the output is a numeric value. And then the next step is you have to then fine-tune the model and evaluate and analyze the results. This goes back, if you are interested, to an innovation that actually comes from this fast AI community published in ACL Anthology, which I'm sure is very familiar to you. And the basic idea here is that we can use these foundation models, which they call here language model 1 or 3, to actually learn all the kind of intricate details of a language, generally English, but I'm sure also in Farsi you have language models. And then the actual model that we use in our case to predict the years, they do that to classify movie reviews here, only has to focus on this particular task and not has to learn all the details of the language again. And this has, of course, been, I think, the single biggest breakthrough in kind of natural language processing in recent years. Still, I wasn't confident enough that my data was good enough to actually do this kind of complex task of analyzing the year. So I also added some data augmentation, text augmentation, which I can also highly recommend to use. In those days, and that was all a bit more complicated and hands-driven. Nowadays, you can also do this with this Hugging Face interface yourself directly. And what I did is I used the Google Translate API to back translate. What I meant is I translated the original English into any of the random languages that Google can randomly choose one of the languages that Google can translate into, and then back translate this in the hope that I will insert certain linguistic differences that allow you to actually enhance the original data set. So then I have no time becomes I do not have time in this back translation. And to my great surprise, this delivered incredibly good results. On the left-hand side, you see here there is the visualization of the predictions. So the bottom x-axis is the actual year of the resolution, and the y-axis is the predicted year. So the optimal would be the kind of diagonal. And you see that that is a kind of light gray line that is not so nicely coming out in this Google meeting. Screen sharing, but the kind of thick black line here is approximating this optimal line very nicely. But if you look into the individual years on the right-hand side, you see also that while the model overall is performing much better than I thought, with a kind of standard error of less than 1 year, it actually has struggled, of course, at the beginning. Now, one thing is, if you are interested in the humanities, of course, we don't just want to have great performing models, but we actually want to produce something that is also adding to kind of research. So in this field, Claudia told me about work that considers the UN Security Council as now, since the end of the Cold War, working mainly on kind of humanitarian issues. So I thought, how can we find it out? Whether that's correct according to the resolutions. And so then I used kind of Hugging Face methods to establish the single most important features that led it to make these kind of decisions that it made, which of course, in my case, words, so particular words. And then I simply choose the 500 most important of all these words, and then try to do a very simple model again, based on these 500 most important words only, which you see on this kind of more distributed line, light gray line on the left-hand side. You see that by the beginning, when the data is not great, it struggles clearly, but at the end, you see that these words really describe very well the kind of timeline that we're looking at. I use then these words, these 500 most important words, to make a quick topic model to understand the distribution of the kind of topics of the UN Security Council over time. And you see on the right-hand side that this nicely splits up into 3 different time periods. And the first one is the kind of organization until the early 1970s. Of the UN Security Council. Then you have the kind of typical Cold War kind of concerns with very many regions around the world. And then comes this kind of 1990 difference of the end of the Cold War. And rather than seeing now focus on humanitarianism, I think I would rather describe this as a diversifying of the various objectives of this UN Security Council. So this is another recent article that came out with the Nature, Humanities and Social Science Communications. It's also open access, where I thought I think a little bit differently about all these collaborations that I did with social science and humanities scholars over the years. And I think about this in terms of the kind of ways of not just doing the analytics, so in the sense of what Claudia has shown with the kind of visualizations and what I've just shown also with the language models, but actually in terms of what we do to the data. Yeah, and as many of you will know, when you do this kind of data analysis, you have to change the data set a lot. As Claudia said, you have to at the beginning clean it and so on, but also doing the actual visualization or other computational analysis, you have to change the data set. And I thought maybe we could rephrase this as this idea of reassembling these archives. And here I was more interested in the kind of more how we can do this critically to develop new knowledge. And I based this on 3 different scholars. The first one is Stola, who is working on post-colonial archives or colonial archives and post-colonial interests. And she framed this famous idea of to work against the grain of these archives, because these archives, of course, are related to power relations in the sense of what they represent and do not represent. So many colonial voices were not represented in these archives, and Stola tries to recover them by working against their grain. But she also emphasizes that you have to then understand actually how they were constituted in the first place, these archives. So you have to read along the grain. Now, what she didn't do is she actually looked at only official archives in the sense of government archives, etc. But of course, now we have many online different versions of archives around the world, which the famous British historian Hobsbawm described as kind of grassroots archives that become relevant to our work because we have a certain grassroots research interest in them. Yeah, so there might not be official archives, but by developing our own research interest in them, we can actually also reassemble them. And then the target of reassembling is this idea of either extending what's in these archives, building new archives, or reconfiguring existing ones, or working against the internal discriminations by discovering new voices, different perspectives. And this is what I call intensifying. So just 2 quick examples. The first one here is about this extensifying. This is now 2 examples taken from the work with Claudia. It's another project that we did together looking into the online representation of NGOs, non-governmental organizations in the United Kingdom. And here we use the Internet Archive, and I'm sure it's also familiar with to many of you, but just to say this again, it's basically a snapshot of the websites of over time. So whatever, if you're interested in the University of Amsterdam website in the 2000s, you can look this up in the Wayback Machine. And since then, there have been lots of digital humanities projects that try to use this resource to represent critical social history. And here we were interested in these NGOs that were selected by Claudia and her team, working on privacy mainly. But actually, there's a problem with this approach. If we try to basically remake this archive of the Internet Archive and extend it towards these kind of perspective of these NGOs, which is that the Internet Archive records snapshots according to the importance of the site. So they record much more frequently bigger sites, like in this case Amnesty, that are also more often visited. That is, of course, good for the Internet Archive, but not very good if you want to reassemble and develop critical voices in there. So we had to develop a new way of doing a different temporal sampling of these archives. And then very briefly now, also coming back now to the other project that Claudia presented on, there were lots of different ways that we then discarded for the final paper to actually explore these archives, not just through visualizations, but for instance, through looking at the subjects and the actions in this. And again, as you are linguists, I don't need to explain to you what syntactic parsing is. But just briefly, so you basically look at each individual sentence or combinations of sentences, and then you look at the subjects and the verbs in there. And the subjects describe the actors, and the verbs describe the actions. And then you can simply analyze what are the most frequent combinations. So how in this parliamentary archive do we speak about certain things? And then we see here on the left-hand side that we are in the UK archives, they call to power, they make a point, and so on. But maybe more interesting is actually to think about this not just in terms of the most frequent combinations, but where do we also have infrequent combinations? And you can see that here on the right-hand side, linking to the ideas of right. Yeah, so like the idea of smaller and larger combinations of these ideas of formulating rights. So these are the 6 cases, so the 6 kind of example projects that I based this on. And the one on that Claudia presented earlier on is one on the second one, public transparency, where we have these verbatim parliamentary transcripts, which we made into a different type of archive by looking at the kind of specific discussions on security, so a specific issue of security. Then Claudia also mentioned already that the challenge was here that the grain of this archives was built on this kind of historical metadata schema that worked very well for historical parliamentary records, but it was not very useful for us. So we had to reconfigure this by, for instance, looking at these kind of combinations of actors and actions. So that's it from us. Thank you so much again for inviting us. It's very exciting for us to be with you, at least virtually, and talk about our work on digital humanities and international relations. Claudia presented how we think that visualizations can help with exploring kind of the complex data that we find in things like parliamentary archive. And I think how we can also develop this to investigate and find out more about maybe discourses that are not so present in these archives. Claudia spoke about absences and so on. I spoke about reading against the grain. And then I wanted to also encourage you to think much more about this idea by Hobsbawm, think much more with this idea of Hobsbawm to think about the world or the online world, at least, as constituted by many different types of online archives that you can explore in diverse new ways. So thank you very much, and I will stop the sharing now, and I'm looking forward to your questions. How do I stop?
No. We did our best. Is anyone working on archives? Are you? I mean, is anyone in the virtual room working on any archives, or what kind of textual material? What kind of text do you work with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a linguistic, basically. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I guess a corpus is a cleaner version of an archive. So you would make yeah. Do you use Hugging Face too, Pesat, or is that a kind of thing that do you do this kind of Hugging Face work already in Iran? Or? Yeah, yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, nice.
Excuse me, I have a question. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. My question is, what do you think data visualization, especially in feminism, will do for like searching for example, internalized misogyny in texts or in literature or in news, and how it affects society? Because I think sometimes we cannot show the real impact of it on how people think and how news is framed and how we tell our stories. And I wanted to ask, what do you think it will do, how it can help us?
So I think, I mean, thank you so much. I think data visualization can't do everything, right? So in a sense, it depends on the material that is there. But your question reminded me, I've actually this thesis that Tobias told me about, this PhD thesis, right? Somebody who basically analyzed the kind of right-wing sites. Tobias, am I right? So I think, and I'm not sure what visualizations they use, but I think that's something interesting in trying to basically visualize and understand the elements, right? The elements of these different discourses to then think what kind of, because there's at the heart of it, there's also kind of a form of contestation that we can make visible in order to try to challenge it. But the elements, it seems to me that the elements of that kind of contestations are important. The other elements are about, of course, there's a lot of emotion as well, right? In some of these discourses. So I think that there are elements that we could analyze, but I don't think that data visualization is always the answer. So we had this debate also in terms of the research that we have done, where data visualization actually we tried to do data visualization, but a lot of the other methods were not lending themselves to visualization. And again, I'm not a digital humanist, so I can't say too much about which ones work, like with visualizations, and which ones don't work with visualization. But yeah, so maybe it is not visualization, right? And then I'm a political, so I was trained as a political scientist. So in terms of kind of seeing effects on society, of course, there are other methods, right? So speaking, interviewing people, and so on. So people use a lot of other methods, and I think that's something to consider as well. Tobias, because I know you need to.
No.
There's a question in the chat as well. Maybe that's.
I wrote to them that I can be 5-10 minutes late. Don't worry. So Fatima, that's a great question, and I think so I mean, not surprising, maybe I like digital humanities. And one good thing about digital humanities is that we are able to actually develop different perspectives on history and social relations because we can look at the whole of the collections, right? So in the past, we mainly were looking at whatever kings and queens did, or any other powerful general or whatever. But now we can actually look at collections that are much more about the everyday experiences of people. And then to answer and that I think is, so to say, already a critical thing that you just simply can't do without digital truth. And I think, so to say, the idea was here that what you could do then is to look at how particular, for instance, pronouns or other indicators of gender are associated in these collections then with particular types of other words. Yeah, so, and that will represent to you actually, particular ideas about this gender. So, famous example was a critical paper on the word-to-vec algorithm that did that over the whole internet corpus, where the female pronoun was associated with, I think, crying and makeup and these kind of things. And you could see the inherent biases in these kind of language models, right? Then I think it is also interesting, and I think that's a bit what Claudia indicated, Yegane, I hopefully pronounced that your name correctly here, that the idea is that you can also look at what's not there in these archives. And I think that is, often more telling than kind of these active representations. So what kind of voices are not there? And that's really, I think, what we work now a lot in Amsterdam on. So we try and understand methods to represent people, for instance, in kind of in early modern Amsterdam, what kind of people we would have expected to be in these archives, but are simply not there. And I think that's also something you can do with these different methods. Yeah, so this is my two answers. So it's on one hand side, I think you can actually look at the voices that are there and how they are affiliated with ideas, yeah, but you can also try and reconstruct what's not there. And then I have the kind of question by Pegar. Is there any special tool for corpus archive person? I mean by app. Do you mean how to make an archive or how to transform an archive into a corpus? Or
Yeah, and I guess on the second question, we can use those methods on any text, right? So
yeah. So I'm not a computational linguist, or I studied texture analytics a long time ago, but from the other side, from computer science. So I think in terms of developing corpora, I think Merzad already mentioned NLTK, of course. So that's basically a tool to give you a way of representing any kind of text into something that a computer can process. And then I want to also emphasize that it's actually very dependent on the particular toolkit that you want to use. So you will have to use very different tools to actually make this work for Hugging Face, for instance. So for Hugging Face, you have to use their own tokenizers that are part of these language models. So if I understand the distinction of what is a corpus correctly as something that is basically text, but made for computer processing or quantitative analysis, then I think it really depends on the toolkit that you use. If you are interested in the latter one, I always say to my students, deep learning sounds very scary, but actually this Hugging Face world, that's about 5 lines of doing things to actually run it. So I would only encourage you to explore this a bit online and try this. So it's really not very difficult anymore. Very exciting times we live in to be able to do all this work. Does it answer your question, Digga? Good. Yeah, that's the only thing that, if I may so say. So I mean, I've been teaching kind of people from non-traditional background computational methods now for almost 2 decades, and it is much easier than you think. may I say that? And I think a certain advantage of non-tool-based approaches, like going directly to the programming languages, is of course that your tools always die, or you don't have access to them anymore, and you also often don't really understand the decisions why they make certain things, right? So I would almost always encourage people now to go the programming way directly rather than going via the, you see, so it's really not so difficult anymore, A, and B, it is simply for your own stability of your work, very, very useful. Yeah. But I think Pigar also had another question, actually, that maybe Claudia can answer better, no? So
yeah, so I mean, the analyzing interviews, right, on people's perspectives. I mean, if you mean using some of these methods, yes, but I think it's dependent on how much data you have, right? Because if you've got 3 interviews, right, then or 5 interviews or 10 interviews, you can analyze them. But it is also interesting that we now have archives of people testimonies, right? So there are many organizations that often collect stories, and you can also find, I mean, you can analyze your own interviews, but I think it depends on the amount of data, right, and the kind of methods, but also the kind of questions that you can do. Because again, I got reminded of this article that we often talk about, Tobias, in Poetics, right, that analyze a very small kind of amount of documents using a specific linguistic theory to analyze like the intricate relations between, subject, verb, object, right, to kind of see again who is the actor, where is agency, what kind of power relations emerge in that text. And you can do that on a small kind of, with a small amount of text or data. But I think it makes a difference, right? So I think we worked in this case with quite large and very large bodies of text, right, that were also unstructured data. So we had to do a lot of work to also structure the data. We also used other people who had structured data before, like in parliamentary archives. So a lot of people had cleaned some of the data, like whatever, to create some. So rather than corpus, we call it structured, the structured data that we could use. Yeah, very large amount of text, and that was also our interest in tracing some of these historical transformations, right? Tracing across time, how certain questions change, certain organizations change their practices, and so on.
I do actually. Thank you very much. I hope you have my voice. Thank you indeed. I am Farzad and I study linguistics, PhD in Tabriz University. So representing. Thank you very much. And from the northwestern part of Iran. And the reason why many of the audience have reservations, I think it's because we're not sure if our questions are relevant to the topic. I hope mine is actually. And at the end of the day, I think the visual representation wants to bridge the gap between the academics, the archives, and the people in the real world. Is that so? And or is it just is it of a descriptive nature, and it wants to be able to help the academics for analytics, or is it just to be utilized by the governments? Or is it just to raise awareness? Is it to bridge the gap and have people more feel? Is it more inclusive? Does it want to raise awareness? And is it successful in doing so? That's my question. Thank you very much.
It's a great question,
Thank
Farad.
you.
So definitely relevant. Also, can I quickly answer, Claudia, because then I have to leave, and so unfortunately, so this almost goes to the heart of the paper, Farad, and I think all the dimensions you mentioned on visualizations are all part of our thinking. Yeah, so that definitely you can represent complex numerical relationships to different type of people who find it maybe not so accessible, but it's also a tool of exploring, right? And I think that's really the humanities perspective on this tool that Claudia mentioned, Drucker. So where this is also a matter of changing interpretations and shifting the visualizations, and in the process of exploring complex data. So it's not just a finished product, yeah, as a kind of communication thing, but a communication tool, but it's also a way of exploring the data in itself. Yeah. So, and now I really need to apologize. I already get a lot of messages where I am. I have to go to the other meeting. It's been such a pleasure and honor, and I wish we all meet each other in whatever times again at some point. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, and good luck with your future work, everyone. Bye-bye.
I'll just say something quickly to your question, Fazat, because I do think it's really important, but I think it's also pretty much everything of what you said and what Tobias said. So data visualizations can be used for all these purposes, right? And they are used. So again, I mean, from the media and the newspapers that I am familiar with, and I can see, and you can tell me what you from your own experience. I mean, data visualization is not something that only academics do, right? It's something that the media does, newspapers does. I mean, sorry. If you look at some of the English language newspaper, other languages as well, now we have a lot of data visualization, right? And they do exactly this. They both create awareness, but they also want to influence policies, right? And they're very much also about emotions, because often they, the visualizations carry sometimes, kind of the catastrophic imaginaries or depictions of climate change or so on. So you can have, the data, the temperatures going up. So you can have very different, I mean, it's not necessarily about linguistics, but you can have very different representations. We had, for example, again, people like, if you think of the visualizations in terms of pronouns, right, and the kind of discrepancies in terms of the internet data, again, all of a sudden it became clear to people what would have been very dispersed otherwise, and maybe they would have experienced as anecdotal, right? Like something that, you might come across and you think, oh, why is this happening? Rather than then kind of realize that it's something systematic and therefore much more in kind of part of power, rather than something exceptional or incidental or anecdotal, right? That one finds. So that is part of it. But I think in terms of research, if us as researchers, we used it not primarily, right, to communicate this with others, but primarily as a kind of research exploratory method, right? So use us for us to be able to see differently. And it is true that if we can see other things, then other people who are interested in this can also see other things, right? So it's about this kind of question of what is visible, but also then if things are there, they also need to be made legible. So there is something about the visualization. A lot of visualizations are also not necessarily easy to read or interpret, but they can create other effects, right? They can create this effect of questioning, right? So that was also important for us as researchers, kind of helping us question what is there, right? Problematize and ask new questions. Yeah. So that's kind of, but thank you very much. I think the whole range, and that's the kind of part of the multiplicity, but also the fact that our methods are never just ours, right? So if you think of digital methods, as you have seen, I mean, they're often invented and used somewhere, and it's a question of how you appropriate work with them. Maybe use other methods, but they can always be reused by others in different ways. So I think that's something interesting to bear in mind. Okay, that was a very kind of long-winded answer, but again, thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure. Yes, and hope Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Enjoy. No worries. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you so much for making time for you on a Friday. Yeah. Bye.